You people really think you can just waltz into places like this, don't you? The crystal shattered against marble. Maya Johnson froze as 200 guests turned to stare. Mrs. Whitmore stepped back, theatrical disgust on her face. These people have no business serving at an event like this. Maya knelt gracefully, her movements careful and precise as she gathered the scattered champagne flute pieces. Each shard caught the light from the massive chandeliers overhead, creating tiny rainbows on the pristine white floor of the Sterling Grand Hotel's ballroom. As she worked, something unexpected happened. She began to hum so softly that only the guests nearest to her could hear. The melody was hauntingly beautiful. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, major op. 9 num. 2. That's an unusual choice for humming, murmured Dr. Sarah Chen, a music professor from the local conservatory who had been standing nearby. Most people wouldn't know that piece. Maya's hands stilled. She caught herself, the melody dying on her lips as heat flooded her cheeks. Around her, the conversations resumed their elegant murmur, but she could feel Dr. Chen's curious gaze lingering on her. Sorry, Maya whispered, focusing intently on the glass fragments. Just something I heard on the radio. But as she reached for the final pieces, her left hand naturally fell into position, thumb on middle C, fingers curved in perfect classical form. It was an unconscious gesture, muscle memory from thousands of hours of practice, but Dr. Chen noticed. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Maya quickly closed her fist and stood balancing the fragments on her silver tray. The ballroom stretched before her in all its gilded magnificence, crystal chandeliers, marble columns and tables draped in ivory silk. But her eyes were drawn inexorably to the far corner, where a magnificent 1920 Steinway Model D grand piano sat in elegant silence. Her breath caught. She knew that piano. Not this specific instrument, but she knew the model. The touch, the way the keys would feel beneath her fingers. She knew it hadn't been tuned in at least 6 months. She could tell from the subtle flatness in the room's acoustics. How does a waitress know about piano tuning? The thought whispered through her mind like a warning. She forced herself to look away from the instrument, but not before something painful flickered across her face, a mix of longing and fear that Dr. Chen was too far away to read. Maya, James, the hotel's assistant manager, appeared at her elbow. Are you all right? Mrs. Whitmore is asking for... I'm fine, Maya said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She glanced once more at the piano, then whispered something under her breath that no one else could hear. Not yet. Maya moved through the ballroom with practiced invisibility, her black uniform allowing her to blend into the shadows between conversations. But there was something different about the way she carried herself, a poise that seemed incongruous with her position. She didn't walk like someone accustomed to servitude. She moved like someone who had once commanded stages. As she refilled champagne glasses, fragments of conversation drifted around her. The guests were discussing tonight's charity gala theme, music education for underprivileged youth. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was the underprivileged youth who had somehow made it, at least she had been. The acoustics in this room are absolutely terrible, complained Mrs. Pemberton, a wealthy patron of the arts. All that marble and those high ceilings create such awful reverb. Maya's hand tightened imperceptibly on the champagne bottle. Actually, the acoustics were nearly perfect for a space this size. The marble provided clarity in the higher frequencies, while the ornate ceiling moldings created natural sound diffusion. Any professional musician would kill to perform in a room with such balanced resonance. She bit her tongue and moved on. I do hope tonight's pianist is better than last month's disaster, another guest was saying. That young man from the conservatory barely knew his Rachmaninoff from his Chopin. Maya paused, ostensibly adjusting the floral centerpiece nearby. Rachmaninoff and Chopin weren't even from the same era. Comparing them was like comparing Shakespeare to Hemingway. Both masters completely different styles. The comment revealed more about the speaker's musical ignorance than any pianist's ability. Stop it, she told herself. You're not that person anymore. But her fingers had already begun tapping against the champagne bottle. Not random fidgeting, but the opening measures of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. the same piece she'd performed for her Juilliard senior recital, the one that had earned her a standing ovation and 3 record label inquiries. That felt like a lifetime ago. "Maya, honey, you doing okay?" She turned to find Carmen, one of the senior waitresses, watching her with concern. Carmen had been kind to her since her first day 8 months ago, one of the few staff members who treated her like a person rather than just another pair of hands. "I'm fine," Maya replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." "Don't let them get to you," Carmen said quietly, glancing toward where Mrs. Whitmore held court near the silent piano. "That woman's been complaining about everything tonight, the temperature, the canapes, the flower arrangements. Some people just need someone to look down on to feel better about themselves." Maya nodded, but her attention had shifted to the conversation Mrs. Whitmore was having with a distinguished gentleman in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Even from across the room, she could feel the authority radiating from him. This had to be Richard Sterling himself, owner of the Sterling Grand, and the man whose empire had built this temple to elegance. "The problem with these charity events," Mrs. Whitmore was saying, her voice carrying despite the room's chatter, "is that they attract the wrong sort of people, staff included. We simply cannot maintain standards when we hire, well, you know the type." Maya's jaw clenched. She knew exactly what type Mrs. Whitmore meant. "Speaking of staff," Sterling replied, his voice deep and commanding, "where is tonight's pianist?" The program was supposed to begin 15 minutes ago. Maya found herself leaning closer, her trained ear picking up every word despite the ambient noise. A skill she'd developed during her performance years, the ability to isolate specific sounds in conversations, even in crowded venues. "Oh, some emergency, I believe," Mrs. Whitmore waved dismissively. "Honestly, Richard, this is exactly what I mean about reliability. These artistic types are so unpredictable." Sterling's expression darkened. "This is a disaster. Half the board of trustees are here tonight, and we promised them a performance of Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2. You can't just find someone to play that on short notice. It requires a master-level pianist." Maya's breath caught. Her fingers, which had been absently tracing the champagne bottle's surface, stilled completely. Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2 in C minor. She knew every note, every dynamic marking, every subtle pause and accelerando. She had performed it dozens of times, could play it in her sleep. But that was before her mother's diagnosis, before the medical bills, before she had to choose between her career and her family. "How do you know so much about classical music?" The voice startled her. Carmen was looking at her with curiosity, having apparently noticed Maya's intense focus on the conversation across the room. What do you mean?" Maya stammered. "You always seem to know what they're talking about when they discuss music. Like just now, your whole body changed when they mentioned that Russian composer's name." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had to be more careful. I used to listen to classical music with my mother." It wasn't entirely a lie. Her mother had filled their small apartment with music jazz standards, classical pieces, spirituals that soared from their old radio, while Mama worked her 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Carmen studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Well, you've got better taste than most of these people. Half of them wouldn't know good music if it bit them." As Carmen moved away, Maya allowed herself one more glance at the magnificent Steinway. Its black surface reflected the chandeliers like a dark mirror, and for just a moment she could almost feel the smooth ivory keys beneath her fingertips, could almost hear the opening chord of the concerto that had once defined her dreams. Almost. Richard Sterling moved through his domain like a man accustomed to having the world bend to his will. At 45, he had built the Sterling Hotel empire into a symbol of luxury and exclusivity. And tonight's charity gala was supposed to showcase that reputation to the city's most influential donors. Instead, it was turning into a disaster. "James!" His voice cut through the elegant chatter as he summoned the assistant manager. "Where is our pianist?" The program should have started 20 minutes ago. Maya, refilling water glasses at a nearby table, found herself in the direct path of Sterling's barely controlled frustration. She kept her eyes down, but she could feel the weight of his presence, the expensive cologne, the perfectly pressed tuxedo, the aura of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Sir Marcus Chen called from the hospital, James said, slightly out of breath. Car accident on the freeway. He's conscious but can't make it tonight. Conscious but can't. Sterling's jaw tightened. Do you understand what this means? We have the mayor here, 3 city council members, and the entire board of the symphony orchestra. I promised them a performance of Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2, not some elevator music substitute. Maya's hand trembled slightly as she filled a water glass. Rachmaninoff again? The universe seemed determined to torment her with reminders of what she'd given up. I've called every pianist in the city, James continued desperately. The conservatory, the university music department, even the high school programs. Either they're already booked or they don't have the skill level for Rachmaninoff. This is exactly what I mean about unreliable people, Mrs. Whitmore interjected, materializing beside Sterling, like a vulture scenting opportunity. You simply can't depend on these artistic types. No sense of responsibility. Sterling's steel-gray eyes swept the room, taking in the expectant faces of his guests, the empty piano bench, the growing murmur of disappointment. His gaze passed over Maya without recognition. She was just another uniformed servant, invisible in the way that wealthy people had perfected. What about recorded music? James suggested weakly. Recorded music! Sterling's voice was deadly quiet. At a live charity gala for music education, in front of the people who fund this city's cultural programs. He ran a hand through his silver-touched hair. No, absolutely not. Maya found herself stepping slightly closer, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't quite name. The conversation was pulling at something deep inside her, something that had been dormant for too long. Sir, James tried again, maybe we could postpone the musical portion and disappoint 300 guests who paid $500 per plate specifically to hear live classical music. Sterling's control was fraying at the edges. Do you have any idea what this could do to our reputation, to our future bookings? Perhaps, Mrs. Whitmore said with poisonous sweetness. This is what happens when you don't maintain proper standards in hiring. The help these days simply doesn't understand the importance of excellence. That word help hit Maya like a physical blow. She had heard it before in conservatory hallways and concert venues whispered by people who looked at her dark skin and assumed she didn't belong in their rarefied world of classical music. But this time was different. This time she could actually help. The thought was terrifying. Sterling turned to scan the room, his frustration mounting. Does anyone here play piano? Anyone at all? I don't care if it's Mary had a little lamb at this point. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. A few murmured about rusty skills or forgotten lessons. Dr. Chen, the music professor, who had noticed Maya's humming earlier, opened her mouth as if to speak, then glanced toward Maya with a puzzled expression. What we need, Sterling continued, his voice rising slightly, is someone who actually understands music. Someone with training, with discipline, with... He gestured toward the magnificent Steinway. That piano costs more than most people's houses. It deserves to be played by someone who respects what it represents. Maya's fingers twitched involuntarily. She knew exactly what that piano represented. Countless hours of practice dreams built note by note, the sublime marriage of a technical perfection and emotional truth that made classical music eternal. She also knew she could walk to that bench right now and play Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2 from memory, with the kind of interpretation that had once made critics compare her to the masters. But that would mean revealing everything. It would mean stepping back into a world that had never quite accepted her, a world she had fled when her mother needed her more than her career did. Sir, James's voice was small. What would you like me to tell the guests? Sterling's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, Maya glimpsed the man beneath the imperial facade, someone who genuinely cared about music, who understood its power to transform an evening from merely expensive to truly memorable. Tell them, Sterling began, then stopped. His gaze swept the room once more, passing over Maya again without seeing her. Tell them we're working on a solution. Maya took a step backward, then another. Her heart was pounding with the rhythm of the concerto's opening measures, her hands trembling with muscle memory that 24 years of training had embedded in her very bones. She could save this evening. She could give these people the music they came to hear, could honor the instrument that sat silent and waiting. All she had to do was step forward and claim who she really was. Instead, she turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving Richard Sterling to face his crisis alone. For now, Maya had barely reached the kitchen doors when she heard her name called sharply across the ballroom. Maya Johnson. She turned to see James hurrying toward her, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that looked like fear. Behind him, Mrs. Whitmore stood with her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at her lips. Richard Sterling watched the scene unfold with cold calculation. "Yes, sir." Maya's voice was steady, professional. 8 months of working here had taught her to mask her emotions perfectly. "Mrs. Whitmore has brought a concern to my attention," James said, his eyes unable to meet hers. "About the incident earlier, with the champagne glass." Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she was forced to defend her right to simply exist in spaces like this. "It was an accident, sir. I've already cleaned." "The concern," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, stepping forward with theatrical authority, "is about competence, about whether certain people can handle the level of service our guests expect." The conversations around them had begun to quiet. Maya could feel eyes turning toward them, the prurient interest of wealthy people watching drama unfold among the hired help. It was entertainment for them, a momentary diversion from their own polished lives. "I've been observing the staff tonight," Mrs. Whitmore continued, her voice carrying just far enough to ensure an audience. "And frankly, I'm concerned about standards. This is supposed to be the Sterling Grand, not some budget establishment." Maya's hands clenched at her sides. She knew exactly what Mrs. Whitmore was doing, using coded language to say what she couldn't say directly. Not in 2024, not in front of witnesses. But the message was clear enough. "Mrs. Whitmore," James began weakly, "Maya is one of our most reliable." "Reliable?" Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was sharp as crystal. "She can barely carry a tray without dropping it. And earlier I heard her humming something inappropriately complex. It was quite distracting." Maya's blood ran cold. The Chopin Nocturne. Mrs. Whitmore had heard her humming Chopin and somehow found it objectionable. "I don't understand the problem," Maya said carefully. "With humming." "The problem," Mrs. Whitmore said, turning to address the growing circle of onlookers, "is appropriateness, knowing one's place. We don't come to events like this to hear that kind of music from the serving staff." The words hung in the air like poison. Maya felt the familiar sting of being made to feel ashamed of her own knowledge, her own culture, her own worth. It was the conservatory all over again, being told her interpretations were too emotional, her style too urban, her presence itself somehow wrong. Richard Sterling stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Maya found herself holding her breath, waiting to see whether he would defend her or join in her humiliation. "Mrs. Whitmore raises valid concerns about maintaining our standards," Sterling said finally. His voice was measured, businesslike. "Perhaps it would be best if Maya were reassigned to duties that don't involve direct guest interaction." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. Reassigned, removed, made invisible. "Of course," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you think is best, Mr. Sterling." But inside something was breaking. Or perhaps something was being born. "James will find you something in the back of house," Sterling continued, already turning away as if the matter were settled. "We can't afford any more incidents tonight." As Maya was led away from the main ballroom, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Chen, watching her with something that looked like recognition dawning in her eyes. But it was too late for that now. Whatever Dr. Chen might have remembered about a young pianist named Maya Johnson was irrelevant. That person had been officially erased. The back kitchen was a stark contrast to the gilded elegance of the ballroom. Harsh fluorescent lights illuminated stainless steel surfaces and the controlled chaos of a major catering operation. Maya was assigned to washing dishes, a job that kept her hands busy and her face hidden from any wandering guests who might venture into the service areas. But she could still hear everything. The kitchen had speakers connected to the ballroom's sound system, ostensibly so the staff could hear announcements and coordinate service, which meant Maya heard every word as the evening's crisis deepened. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling's voice came through the speakers, professionally smooth despite the disaster unfolding. "We're experiencing a slight delay with tonight's musical program. Please continue to enjoy the reception while we resolve a technical issue." Technical issue. Maya almost smiled at the euphemism. Through the service window, she could see guests milling about in the ballroom, their conversations growing more animated as wine flowed and patience wore thin. The empty piano bench seemed to mock them all, a beautiful instrument rendered useless by circumstances. "Any luck with the backup pianists?" she heard James ask someone nearby. "Nothing," came the reply. "I've called everyone in the greater metropolitan area. Either they can't learn Rachmaninoff in 20 minutes, or they're not skilled enough to attempt it." Maya's hands stilled in the soapy water. 20 minutes. That's all the time that remained before Sterling would have to face his guests and admit complete failure. She knew she could walk out there right now and save them all. Rachmaninoff's Concerto. Number 2 lived in her fingers, in her muscle memory, in the deepest part of her artistic soul. She could perform it without sheet music, could make that Steinway sing with the voice it was meant to have. But they had just humiliated her, reassigned her, made it clear that she didn't belong in their world, that her presence was an embarrassment to their standards. Why should she save them? "This is a disaster." Sterling's voice came through the speakers again, though this time it sounded like he was speaking to someone nearby rather than addressing the crowd. "Do you have any idea what this is going to cost us? The mayor specifically requested this piece. Half our donors are classical music patrons. They're going to think we're amateurs." Maya dried her hands, slowly considering. Through the service window, she could see the magnificent piano waiting in its pool of golden light. In her mind, she could hear the opening measures of the concerto, those powerful haunting chords that had once moved audiences to tears. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper in her memory, "Your music is your truth, baby girl. Don't let them steal that from you." But what if revealing her truth meant risking everything she had left? What if they rejected her again, the way the classical music world had always rejected her? What if she wasn't as good as she remembered? The questions swirled in her mind as Sterling's voice continued to drift from the speakers, growing more desperate with each passing minute. The man who had just dismissed her was facing the collapse of his carefully orchestrated evening, and only she could save him. The irony was not lost on her. Maya looked down at her hands, hands that had once commanded standing ovations, that had been called gifts from God by her first piano teacher, that had learned to hide their power in service of survival. 20 minutes until complete humiliation. She took a deep breath and made her choice. Maya stood at the industrial sink, her hands submerged in lukewarm dishwater, listening to the slow-motion disaster unfolding beyond the kitchen walls. Through the speakers, she could hear the growing restlessness of the guests, the forced cheer in the servers' voices as they tried to distract 300 increasingly impatient donors. 15 minutes, someone whispered near the service window. "If we don't have music in 15 minutes, Sterling's going to have to make an announcement." She closed her eyes and let the familiar weight of the decision settle over her. In her mind, she could see the piano bench, could feel the smooth ivory keys beneath her fingertips. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2 played in her memory, those 4 thunderous chords that announced the soloist's presence, like a declaration of war against silence. Dum-dum-dum-da. Her hands moved unconsciously in the dishwater fingers, finding the chord progression, even as they gripped a champagne flute. "Maya." She turned to find Carmen standing behind her, concern etched across her weathered face. The older woman had been watching her for several minutes, Maya realized, noting the way her shoulders had tensed with each update from the ballroom. "You okay, honey? You look like you're about to jump out of your skin." Maya dried her hands on her apron, considering her words carefully. "Carmen, what would you do if you could help someone who had just humiliated you?" Carmen's eyebrows rose. "That's a hell of a question. Depends on what kind of help we're talking about. The kind that could save their entire evening, their reputation, maybe even their business. And the humiliation, Maya's jaw tightened. The kind that makes you question whether you're worth the oxygen you breathe. Carmen studied her for a long moment, then glanced toward the service window, where they could see Sterling pacing near the piano, his phone pressed to his ear as he made increasingly desperate calls. "You know something about music, don't you?" Carmen said quietly. It wasn't really a question. Maya had been too careful, but not careful enough. 8 months of working together, and Carmen had noticed the way Maya's eyes lit up during conversations about classical pieces, the way she unconsciously corrected guests' mispronunciations of composers' names under her breath. "I used to," Maya said simply. "Used to what?" Maya took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. "I used to be a pianist." Carmen's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Sterling's voice cut through the kitchen speakers again, this time sharp with barely controlled panic. "James, get me the event coordinator for Symphony Hall. Maybe they have someone on standby. Anyone. I don't care if it's a middle school student at this point." The desperation in his voice was almost painful to hear. Maya found herself thinking about the man she'd observed earlier, not just the imperious hotel owner, but someone who genuinely seemed to understand what music meant to an evening like this. Someone who had called the piano a thing of beauty that deserved to be played by someone who respected what it represented. He wasn't wrong about that. "How good were you?" Carmen asked softly. Maya's throat tightened. "Good enough. Good enough for Rachmaninoff. Good enough for anywhere." The words hung between them like a confession. Carmen nodded slowly, as if something she'd suspected had finally been confirmed. "Then what are you doing in my kitchen washing dishes?" It was the question Maya had been avoiding for 8 months. The question that went to the heart of everything she'd given up, everything she'd lost, everything she'd chosen. "I had to take care of my mother," she said finally. "She got sick, cancer. I couldn't tour and be her caregiver at the same time, so She gestured helplessly at the kitchen around them. "I chose her. And now she's gone, and I don't know how to be that person anymore. I don't know if I'm still good enough. I don't know if they'll accept me. And after tonight," Maya's voice broke slightly, "after tonight, I know they won't." Carmen was quiet for a long moment, listening to the increasingly frantic conversations drifting from the ballroom. When she spoke again, her voice was firm with the kind of wisdom that came from decades of watching people struggle with their own worth. "Baby girl, let me tell you something. I've been watching rich folks for 30 years, and you know what I've learned. They don't respect you more when you make yourself smaller. They respect power. And right now, you've got all the power in this room. I'm a black woman in a service uniform. I have no power. You're a black woman who can save their asses when nobody else can. That's the only kind of power that matters right now." Through the speakers, they heard Sterling's voice again, this time addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to need just a few more minutes to resolve our technical difficulties. Please continue enjoying the reception." Technical difficulties? Maya almost laughed at the euphemism. 10 minutes, someone whispered urgently near the service window. Maya looked down at her hands that had once been featured in classical piano magazine, hands that had performed at Carnegie Hall as part of a young artist showcase, hands that knew the weight and response of 1,000 different instruments, hands that were currently washing dishes in a hotel kitchen while a $200,000 Steinway sat silent in the next room. The absurdity of it struck her like a physical blow. "What if I'm not good enough anymore?" she whispered. Carmen smiled, and for the first time all evening it reached her eyes. "Honey, muscle memory doesn't lie, and neither does talent. If you were good enough for Carnegie Hall, you're sure as hell good enough for a bunch of rich folks eating overpriced chicken." Maya felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and shame she'd been carrying for 2 years. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Your music is your truth, baby girl. Don't let them steal that from you." They had tried to steal it tonight, had succeeded temporarily. But the music was still there, waiting in her fingers, waiting in her heart, waiting for her to claim it back. Maya untied her apron with hands that were suddenly steady. She smoothed down her black uniform skirt and checked her reflection in the polished surface of a steel refrigerator. The woman looking back at her wasn't the terrified girl who had fled the classical music world 2 years ago. This was someone who had survived loss, who had made impossible choices, who had learned that dignity wasn't something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something you claim for yourself. "Carmen," she said quietly, "if this goes badly, it won't. But if it does, then you'll go down fighting instead of hiding, and that's worth something all by itself." Maya nodded, took one last deep breath, and walked toward the ballroom doors. It was time to remind them all who she really was. Maya emerged from the kitchen doors like a woman walking into battle. The ballroom stretched before her in all its gilded splendor, but the atmosphere had shifted. Where earlier there had been elegant conversation and the gentle clink of champagne glasses, now there was an undercurrent of restless energy. Guests clustered in small groups, their voices slightly too loud, their laughter slightly too forced. They were wealthy people accustomed to flawless service, and the evening's failure was beginning to fray their polished composure. At the center of it all stood the Steinway, magnificent and silent. Maya's steps slowed as she approached the main ballroom floor. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to the safety of invisibility. She was still wearing her black service uniform, still marked as staff, in a room full of people who had just watched her be humiliated and dismissed. But her mother's voice was stronger than her fear. "Your music is your truth, baby girl." She moved along the periphery of the room, staying close to the walls, where shadows offered some protection. Her trained eye assessed the acoustic space with automatic precision, the way sound would carry from the piano's position, the natural reverb created by the high ceilings, the positioning of the audience. It was perfect. Everything about this room was designed to showcase music at its finest. "Any word from the backup pianist?" she heard a guest ask nearby. "Nothing," came the frustrated reply. "Sterling's going to have to make an announcement soon. This is becoming embarrassing." Maya's hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to keep walking. With each step, muscle memory began to awaken. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Shoulders back, spine straight, the bearing of someone who had once commanded stages. Her gait became more purposeful, less apologetic. She was 20 feet from the piano when Dr. Chen spotted her. The music professor's eyes widened in recognition that went beyond their brief interaction earlier. Dr. Chen took a step forward, her mouth opening as if to speak, but Maya caught her eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. Not yet. She needed to reach the piano on her own terms. 15 feet. Richard Sterling was standing near the bar, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand running through his hair in a gesture of barely contained frustration. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying. "If you can get someone here in the next 5 minutes, I'll pay triple their usual rate." 10 feet. Maya could feel the instrument's presence like a gravitational pull. The Steinway's black lacquered surface reflected the chandelier light like dark water, and she could almost hear it calling to her. Her fingers flexed unconsciously, remembering the weight of keys, the responsiveness of hammers against strings. 5 feet. Mrs. Whitmore spotted her first. "What is she doing here?" The woman's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. "I thought we agreed that certain staff members would be kept away from the guests." Conversations began to quiet as heads turned toward Maya. She felt the familiar weight of judgment, the assumption that her presence in this space was somehow inappropriate. But this time, instead of shrinking under their gaze, she drew strength from it. Let them look. They were about to see something they would never forget. Maya reached the piano bench and stood behind it, her hands resting lightly on its curved edge. The Steinway rose before her like an altar, its keyboard covered by a protective lid. She could feel the power sleeping within it, 88 keys capable of producing everything from the gentlest whisper to the most thunderous declaration. "Excuse me." Sterling's voice was sharp as he strode toward her, having apparently ended his phone call. "You were specifically instructed to remain in the back of house. What do you think you're doing?" Maya lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that hadn't been there before, the voice of someone who had once been introduced to audiences as one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. I'm here to solve your problem, Mr. Sterling. A murmur rippled through the nearby guests. Sterling's eyes narrowed, clearly caught between irritation and confusion. Your problem, Mrs. Whitmore said with venomous satisfaction, is having staff who don't understand boundaries. Security should remove her immediately. No. The word came from Dr. Chen, who had moved closer to the piano. Wait. Sterling looked between the two women, clearly trying to assess a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. Dr. Chen, I appreciate your... Richard, Dr. Chen said urgently. Listen to me. I think I know who this is. Maya felt her heart skip. Recognition was dawning in Dr. Chen's eyes, not just of someone who knew classical music, but of someone specific. Someone whose photograph had once appeared in music magazines, whose performances had been reviewed in national publications. That's impossible, Sterling said dismissively. She's a waitress. She's Maya Johnson. The name dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Maya saw several guests exchange glances, some with dawning recognition, others with confusion. In the classical music world, her name had meant something once. Not stardom perhaps, but respect, promise, a future that had seemed limitless, until she had chosen love over ambition, family over fame. Maya Johnson. Dr. Chen continued, her voice growing stronger with certainty. Graduated summa cum laude from Juilliard at 22. Winner of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition's Young Artist Division. She performed at Carnegie Hall as part of the Rising Stars series 3 years ago. Sterling's expression shifted from dismissal to confusion to something that might have been embarrassment. Maya watched him reassess everything. Her posture, her bearing, the way she had unconsciously positioned herself at the piano, like someone who belonged there. That's, he began, then stopped. Why didn't you say anything? Maya's smile was sad but steady. Would it have mattered? 2 hours ago, you watched me be humiliated by a guest and decided I was the problem. You reassigned me to dish duty because Mrs. Whitmore convinced you that people like me don't belong in spaces like this. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Sterling had the grace to look ashamed. But Maya continued, raising the piano's lid with practiced ease. You have a problem, and I have a solution. Her hands found the keys as naturally as a bird finds the sky. Richard Sterling stood frozen, his mind reeling as the implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. Maya Johnson. The name echoed in his memory, dredging up fragments of reviews he'd read years ago. He remembered now, a rising star in the classical world, a young black pianist whose interpretations had been called revolutionary and deeply moving by critics who rarely use such language. There had been buzz about her anticipation, about what she might achieve, and then she had simply disappeared. He stared at the woman before him, the same woman he had dismissed not 2 hours ago, the same woman he had allowed to be humiliated in his own ballroom. The contrast was staggering. Gone was the timid waitress who had cleaned up broken glass. In her place stood someone who carried herself with the quiet confidence of a performer, someone whose very presence seemed to command the magnificent instrument before her. This is impossible, Mrs. Whitmore sputtered, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She could sense the shift in the room's energy, the way other guests were beginning to step closer, drawn by the promise of witnessing something extraordinary. Richard's business mind, trained to assess risk and opportunity in split seconds, was working frantically. If Dr. Chen was right, and the recognition in her voice suggested she was, then he had just committed one of the most spectacular misjudgments of his career. Not just professionally, but morally. You're serious? He said quietly, studying Maya's face. You can actually play Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2. Maya's fingers found a simple chord progression, testing the piano's touch and tuning with the automatic precision of a professional. The sound that emerged was pure and resonant, filling the ballroom's acoustics perfectly. Several guests exhaled in unconscious appreciation. It had been so long since they'd heard the instrument properly voiced. I can play anything you'd like, Maya said simply, but more importantly, I can save your evening. The question is whether you're willing to let me. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. This wasn't just about music anymore. This was about whether Richard Sterling was the kind of man who could admit when he was wrong, who could see past his own prejudices to recognize excellence when it stood before him. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If you're who Dr. Chen says you are, why are you working as a waitress? Why didn't you tell us?" Maya's smile was enigmatic, tinged with old pain and new strength. "Because I learned a long time ago that people like you don't see people like me as anything more than what we're wearing. Tonight proved that lesson rather conclusively. Don't you think?" The words stung because they were true. Richard thought about the dozens of times he had walked past Maya in the corridors of his hotel, never really seeing her, never wondering about her story or her dreams. She had been invisible to him, not because she lacked presence, but because he had chosen not to look. "But you're here now," he said. "I'm here because my mother taught me that talent has an obligation to serve something greater than itself. And because—" Maya paused, her fingers moving to a more complex passage that Richard recognized as Chopin. "Because sometimes the best revenge is excellence." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the growing crowd. Word was spreading throughout the ballroom that something unprecedented was happening at the piano. Guests were abandoning their conversations, their canapes, their carefully orchestrated social networking to witness what promised to be either a spectacular triumph or an equally spectacular failure. Richard found himself caught between admiration and mortification. The woman before him possessed not just talent, but grace under pressure that few people could muster. She had been publicly humiliated, dismissed, and relegated to menial work. Yet here she stood, offering to save the very people who had wronged her. "What do you want?" he asked. Maya's hand stilled on the keys. "I want you to introduce me properly. Not as your waitress who happens to play piano, but as Maya Johnson, concert pianist. I want you to acknowledge that you made assumptions about me based on my appearance and my position, and that those assumptions were wrong. And if I do that, then I'll give your guests a performance they'll never forget." Richard looked around the ballroom at the expectant faces of his donors, his board members, his most important clients. The evening's success hung in the balance, and with it potentially millions of dollars in future business relationships. The pragmatic part of him wanted to accept Maya's offer immediately. She was offering him salvation from a public relations disaster. But the human part of him, the part that had been raised by parents who taught him about dignity and respect, was grappling with something much more complex. This wasn't just about saving face. This was about confronting the uncomfortable truth of his own biases, about admitting in front of 300 of the city's most influential people that he had been spectacularly, shamefully wrong. "You're asking me to humble myself in front of everyone who matters to my business," he said. Maya's eyes met his directly. "I'm asking you to tell the truth. Whether that humbles you or not is up to you." The silence stretched between them, pregnant with possibility and consequence. Richard could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that his next words would define not just the evening, but the kind of man he chose to be. Mrs. Whitmore was watching him with barely concealed horror, clearly hoping he would refuse Maya's terms and restore the social order that made her comfortable. Dr. Chen stood with obvious anticipation, recognizing that she was about to witness either artistic brilliance or social catastrophe. And Maya waited, her hands poised over the keys, offering him the gift of music in exchange for the gift of acknowledgement. Richard Sterling took a deep breath and made his choice. Richard Sterling stood at the crossroads of his own character for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. The ballroom had grown so quiet that the distant sounds of kitchen staff and traffic outside seemed amplified. 300 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. He walked to the small raised platform where a microphone stood ready for the evening's announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly through the ballroom's sound system, "I owe you all an apology for tonight's delays. I also owe someone a much more significant apology." Maya remained seated at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, but Richard could see the subtle tension in her shoulders. This moment would determine not just the evening's outcome, but perhaps the trajectory of both their futures. Earlier tonight, I made assumptions about someone based on her position and appearance rather than her abilities or character. Those assumptions were not just wrong, they were inexcusable. Richard's voice grew stronger with each word. Tonight, our scheduled pianist was unable to perform due to an emergency, but it turns out we have someone far more qualified in our midst. The crowd stirred with curiosity and growing anticipation. I'd like you to meet Maya Johnson, not as our staff member, but as she truly is a Juilliard graduate, Van Cliburn competition winner, and one of the finest classical pianists of her generation. The gasp that rippled through the ballroom was audible. Several guests pulled out their phones, undoubtedly searching for information about Maya's background. Mrs. Whitmore looked as though she'd swallowed something particularly bitter. Richard met Maya's eyes across the room. Ms. Johnson has graciously agreed to perform for us tonight, despite having every reason to refuse. I hope you'll join me in giving her the respect and attention that her extraordinary talent deserves. He began to applaud, and after a moment's hesitation, the rest of the ballroom joined him. But Maya could sense the skepticism underlying the polite response. They were willing to listen, but they weren't yet convinced. Years of watching diversity initiatives and token gestures had made them wary of elaborate setups for mediocre performances. They expected competence, perhaps. They were about to witness mastery. Maya adjusted the piano bench with the automatic precision of someone who had performed on dozens of stages. Her posture shifted into performance mode, spine perfectly aligned shoulders, relaxed but ready hands positioned with the exact curvature that her first teacher had drilled into her 25 years ago. I'll be performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, she announced, her voice carrying clearly without amplification. For those unfamiliar with this piece, it's considered one of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex works in the classical repertoire. She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some showed polite interest. Others barely concealed skepticism. Mrs. Whitmore was whispering urgently to a companion, probably predicting disaster. I'd like to dedicate tonight's performance to my mother, who taught me that music is the language the heart speaks when words aren't enough. Maya's hands found the opening position. For a moment, the ballroom held its breath. Then she played the first chord. The sound that emerged from the Steinway was like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Rich, powerful, perfectly balanced, not just technically correct, but infused with an emotional weight that seemed to physically press against the listener's chest. The second chord followed, then the third, each one building on the last, until the opening phrase rang through the ballroom with such authority that several guests unconsciously stepped back. This wasn't just competent playing. This wasn't even just skilled playing. This was artistry at its highest level. Dr. Chen's hand flew to her mouth. She had seen Maya perform years ago at a small venue, but this was different. Matured, deepened by loss and struggle into something transcendent. The opening melody began Maya's right hand singing the famous theme with a clarity and expressiveness that made the familiar notes sound newly minted. Her left hand provided accompaniment that was both supportive and conversational, creating the illusion of a full orchestra supporting a soloist. Richard Sterling found himself transfixed. He had heard this concerto performed dozens of times by symphony orchestras on recordings at concert halls around the world, but he had never heard it played with such raw emotional honesty. Maya wasn't just performing the notes. She was telling a story, and it was clearly her own story. Around the ballroom, conversations died mid-sentence. Servers stopped pouring wine. Even the kitchen staff had gathered at the service windows, drawn by the music that seemed to fill every corner of the space. Maya's technique was flawless, her fingers dancing across the keys with speed and precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. But technique was just the foundation. What elevated the performance to something magical was the way she inhabited the music, the way each phrase seemed to emerge from her very soul. Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone pale. Whatever she had expected from the waitress who thought she could play piano, it hadn't been this. This was professional-level artistry that belonged on the world's greatest stages. The first movement continued to build Maya's playing, revealing new layers of complexity with each passing measure. She navigated the most challenging passages with an ease that made them sound deceptively simple, while imbuing the gentler sections with a vulnerability that brought tears to several listeners' eyes. By the time she reached the movement's climactic moments, the entire ballroom was under her spell. These were people accustomed to the finest things money could buy, yet they were witnessing something that couldn't be purchased, only earned through years of dedication, sacrifice, and an almost mystical connection between artist and instrument. Maya's hands moved with increasing passion as the first movement neared its conclusion, her entire body swaying with the music's emotional current. She wasn't just playing piano, she was channeling something larger than herself, something that transformed mere sound into pure feeling. The final chord of the first movement rang out, then faded into absolute silence. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then the applause began. As the applause faded and Maya prepared for the second movement, the familiar chord progression triggered something deeper than muscle memory. Suddenly, she was 24 again, sitting in a practice room at Juilliard at 3 in the morning, her fingers bleeding slightly from hours of repetition, her mother's voice echoing from their last phone call. "Baby girl, you sure you eating enough? You sound tired." "I'm fine, Mama. Just practicing for the Van Cliburn audition. The Rachmaninoff it's harder than I thought." You know what your problem is? You trying to play it perfect instead of playing it true. That Russian man, he wrote that music from his heart, not his head. You gotta find your heart in it." Maya's hands found the opening of the second movement, the lyrical, achingly beautiful Adagio sostenuto that had once reduced her to tears in that practice room. Now, as her fingers caressed the melody, she understood what her mother had meant. The notes weren't just technical challenges to be conquered. They were emotions given form, pain transformed into beauty, hope distilled into sound. "And tell me about this piece, baby. What's it saying to you?" Maya had been frustrated that night, her technique flawless, but her interpretation somehow hollow. "It's about struggle, Mama, about fighting through something difficult and finding beauty on the other side." And what you been struggling with?" The question had caught her off guard. At 24, fresh from her competition win, with record labels, interested, and a promising career ahead, what did she have to struggle with? I don't know. Maybe that's the problem." "No, baby. You know. You just scared to admit it." Now, 8 years later, Maya understood. She had been struggling with belonging, with the constant pressure to be twice as good, to get half the recognition, with the subtle and not so subtle messages that she didn't quite fit in the rarefied world of classical music, with the loneliness of being one of the few faces that looked like hers in concert halls and conservatories. Her mother had seen it before Maya herself could name it. The second movement flowed from her fingers like water, each phrase informed by years of hard-won wisdom. She thought of the nights she'd spent in hospital, waiting rooms playing silent scales on her thighs while her mother underwent chemotherapy. The way Mama had insisted on listening to classical music during treatments, saying it made her feel like she was traveling to beautiful places instead of lying in a sterile medical facility. "And play me that Russian piece, baby, the one that sounds like rain on a tin roof and hope at the same time." Maya had played Rachmaninoff for her mother countless times in those final months, sometimes on an actual piano, when the hospital had one available, sometimes just humming the melodies while holding her mother's hand. The music had become their private language, a way of saying things too difficult for words. "I need to take the tour contract, Mama, the one in Europe. It's my big break." "I know, baby, but I can't leave you. Not when I'm dying." The conversation had happened right here, in this same hotel, actually. Maya had been performing at a corporate event downtown, and her mother had insisted on coming, despite her weakness. They'd sat in the lobby afterward. Maya, still in her concert dress, her mother wrapped in the colorful scarf that hid her hair loss. "Maya, listen to me good. Music gonna outlive both of us. But love is what makes music matter. You stay with me because you love me, not because you scared of what people gonna think." I'm not scared. Yes, you are. You scared they're gonna forget about you. You scared you're gonna lose your chance. But baby, if your music real, there always gonna be another chance. There ain't gonna be another me. Maya had chosen love. She'd turned down the European tour, the recording contract, the chance at international stardom. She'd moved back home and spent her mother's final year making sure she was never alone, never afraid, never without music. And when it was over, when the funeral flowers had wilted and the casseroles from church friends had been eaten, Maya had looked at her piano and felt nothing. The music that had once filled her with purpose seemed to mock her. What was the point of beautiful melodies when the person who most loved to hear them was gone? So she'd stopped playing, stopped performing, taken a job that required nothing of her heart and everything of her survival instincts. Until tonight. Now, as the second movement reached its emotional peak, Maya felt her mother's presence as clearly as if she were sitting in the front row. The music was still there, had always been there, waiting for her to find her way back to it. And with it came a profound understanding. She hadn't lost her musical voice when her mother died. She had been preparing to reclaim it. The movement's final notes faded into reverent silence, and Maya felt tears on her cheeks. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of homecoming, of a prodigal daughter returning to herself at last. In the audience, she could see people wiping their own eyes, moved by music that spoke directly to the human heart. This was why she had become a pianist, not for fame or recognition, but for moments like this, when music became a bridge between souls. She raised her hands for the final movement, ready to bring this journey home. Maya wiped her tears with the back of her hand and positioned herself for the final movement. The allegro scherzando, playful yet virtuosic, demanding both technical brilliance and interpretative sophistication. This was where pianists either soared or crashed, where years of training either paid off in triumph or exposed every weakness under the unforgiving spotlight of live performance. She had conquered this movement before, but never like this. Never with an audience that had just witnessed her emotional resurrection, never with the weight of her own story infusing every note. The opening theme burst forth with infectious energy, her fingers dancing across the keys with a precision that made the incredibly difficult passages sound effortless. But there was something more than technical mastery at work. There was joy, pure unbridled joy at being reunited with the music that had defined her identity for so long. Dr. Chen pulled out her phone, not to record but to text a colleague. "You'll never believe who I'm watching right now. Maya Johnson. Yes, that Maya Johnson. She's transcendent." Around the ballroom, the transformation was palpable. What had begun as polite attention had evolved into genuine captivation and now was approaching something close to worship. These were sophisticated people who attended symphony galas and opera premieres as a matter of course, yet they were witnessing something rare. Even in their rarefied circles, a performer operating at the absolute peak of her powers. "My God," whispered Mr. Harrison, the museum director, who had initially seemed skeptical. "I've heard this piece performed by the New York Philharmonic, and this is better." Mrs. Pemberton, the art patron, who had earlier complained about the acoustics, found herself leaning forward in unconscious appreciation. The acoustics she had criticized were now showcasing Maya's performance with crystalline clarity, every subtle dynamic and tonal color amplified and enriched by the ballroom's architecture. Richard Sterling stood transfixed, his business mind momentarily silenced by the realization of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a talented employee who happened to play piano. This was an artist of international caliber, someone whose talent belonged on the world's greatest stages. Someone he had nearly destroyed with his prejudice and assumptions. Maya navigated the movement's technical challenges with increasing confidence, her body swaying with the music's momentum. The playful themes danced between her hands like old friends, while the more dramatic passages surged with emotional power that seemed to fill every corner of the vast space. "I know her," murmured a guest near the back. I know of her. She performed at the Kennedy Center a few years ago. The Washington Post called her a rising star of exceptional promise." "What happened to her?" asked his companion. Why haven't we heard more? But Maya was answering that question through her music. Each phrase told the story of sacrifice and loss of talent, temporarily set aside for love of a woman who had chosen humanity over ambition and was now reclaiming both. The development section built to a fever pitch, Maya's hands flying across the keyboard with such speed and precision that several professional musicians in the audience shook their heads in amazement. This wasn't just competent playing, this was virtuosity that ranked among the finest they had ever witnessed. Dr. Chen was now openly weeping, remembering the young woman she had seen perform years ago and marveling at how that raw talent had matured into something magnificent. She's better than she was before, she whispered to herself. Suffering has made her art deeper. Mrs. Whitmore had gone from pale to ashen, the reality of her earlier behavior crashing over her like a cold wave. She had publicly humiliated someone of international stature, had dismissed extraordinary talent because of her own prejudices. The social implications alone were staggering. By tomorrow, everyone in their circle would know that she had tried to have Maya Johnson removed from service. As Maya approached the concerto's final pages, her playing reached a level of intensity that seemed to physically energize the room. Servers had abandoned all pretense of work, standing mesmerized by the music. Kitchen staff crowded the service windows. Even hotel security had gathered at the ballroom's periphery, drawn by the transcendent sounds echoing through the building. She's not just playing the notes, observed a guest who taught music at the local university. She's telling us who she is, where she's been, what she's overcome. This is autobiography in musical form. The technical demands of the final section would have challenged even seasoned professionals, but Maya met them with an ease that spoke of absolute mastery. Her left hand provided thunderous bass notes that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers, while her right hand sang the melody with a clarity that cut through the acoustic complexity like a silver blade. People throughout the ballroom were pulling out phones, not to film, but to text friends and colleagues. Word was spreading beyond the hotel walls. Something extraordinary was happening at the Sterling Grand. Social media posts began appearing. OMG, you guys! There's a pianist here who's absolutely insane good. Never heard anything like this live. This woman is playing like her life depends on it. Richard found himself thinking about the interviews he would give tomorrow. The questions about how he had failed to recognize such exceptional talent among his own staff. The irony was almost cosmic. He had spent months planning this gala to showcase his hotel's commitment to excellence, only to discover that the greatest excellence in the building had been washing dishes in his kitchen. Maya's interpretation of the final triumphant theme was nothing short of revelatory. What Rachmaninoff had written as a celebration of technical achievement, she transformed into something more personal, a declaration of artistic rebirth, a woman reclaiming her voice after years of silence. The music built to its climactic conclusion, Maya's entire body involved in the performance, now her face radiant with the joy of artistic expression at its purest. This was why she had become a musician, why she had sacrificed comfort and security for the uncertain life of an artist. Not for fame or recognition, but for moments like this, when music became a direct line between human souls. The final chords rang out with the force of destiny reverberating through the ballroom's perfect acoustics until they faded into a silence that felt sacred. For what seemed like eternity, no one moved. The audience sat in stunned appreciation of what they had just witnessed, not just a performance, but a transformation. A woman had sat down at the piano as a dismissed waitress and risen as a revealed artist. Then someone in the back began to clap. Slowly at first, then with growing intensity. The applause spread like wildfire until the entire ballroom erupted in appreciation that bordered on reverence. People leaped to their feet, tears streaming down faces, hands pressed to hearts. This wasn't just applause. This was recognition. This was acknowledgement of something rare and precious that they had been privileged to witness. Maya remained seated at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, overwhelmed by the response. She had performed for audiences around the world, but she had never felt so completely seen, so thoroughly understood. Richard Sterling stepped forward, his own eyes wet with tears he hadn't expected. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "Maya Johnson." As the applause continued to thunder through the ballroom, Dr. Chen stepped forward, her face radiant with the excitement of someone about to share extraordinary news. She had spent the entire performance cross-referencing her memories with her phone, confirming what her musician's instincts had already told her. This wasn't just any talented pianist. This was Maya Johnson, and the classical music world had been mourning her disappearance for nearly 3 years. "Excuse me," Dr. Chen called out, raising her voice above the applause. "May I have everyone's attention, please?" The crowd gradually quieted, though the energy in the room remained electric. Maya remained seated at the piano, still somewhat dazed by the emotional intensity of her performance and the audience's response. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Chen announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in academic and musical circles, "I need you to understand exactly what we've just witnessed tonight." She moved closer to the piano, her phone in hand, displaying a series of articles and photographs she had pulled up during Maya's performance. "Maya Johnson isn't just a gifted pianist who happens to work here. She is, or rather was, one of the most promising artists of her generation." Dr. Chen's voice grew stronger with each word. Winner of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition's Young Artist Award in 2019. Graduate summa cum laude from Juilliard School. Featured performer at Carnegie Hall's Rising Stars series. Murmurs of amazement rippled through the crowd as guests pulled out their own phones, frantically searching for information about Maya's background. But that's not all. Dr. Chen continued scrolling through her phone. Listen to this review from the New York Times after her Carnegie Hall debut. "Miss Johnson's interpretation of Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto was nothing short of revelatory. Her technique is flawless, but more importantly, she brings an emotional depth to the music that transforms familiar passages into moments of profound discovery. This is an artist of exceptional promise who deserves the attention of the classical music world." A woman near the front gasped audibly. "I remember that concert. I was there, but she looked so different." She trailed off, realizing the implications of her words. Maya finally stood from the piano bench, accepting Dr. Chen's revelation with a dignity that spoke of someone who had long ago made peace with difficult truths. Her uniform seemed almost costume-like now, a disguise that could no longer hide her true identity. "There's more," Dr. Chen said, her excitement growing. She was featured on the cover of Classical Piano Quarterly in 2020. The article called her a voice for the new generation of classical musicians. She performed with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and was scheduled to tour with the London Symphony before she simply vanished. Richard Sterling felt his knees weaken as the full magnitude of his earlier behavior crashed over him. He hadn't just dismissed a talented employee, he had humiliated one of the classical music world's rising stars. Someone whose artistry had been celebrated in the most prestigious venues on earth. "Why did she disappear?" called out a guest from the middle of the room. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady despite the weight of so many eyes upon her. "I disappeared because my mother was dying." The ballroom fell completely silent. "She had cancer." Maya continued, her words carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect space. "And I had a choice to make: continue my career or be with her during her final months. I chose love." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the kind of respect that comes when people recognize genuine sacrifice. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, understanding, flooding her expression. "That explains the 3-year gap. The music world wondered what had happened to you. There were rumors of injury or personal crisis, but no one knew the truth." "The truth," Maya said, "is that I've spent the last 3 years learning that there's more than one way to be extraordinary. Taking care of someone you love, working honest jobs to pay medical bills, finding dignity in service, these aren't lesser choices. They're just different ones." Mrs. Pemberton, the art patron, wiped tears from her eyes. "But your talent, weren't you afraid of losing it?" Maya's smile was gentle, but knowing. "Talent isn't something you lose. It's something you choose to use or not use. Tonight I chose to use it again." A guest in the back called out, "Why here, why now?" Maya's expression hardened slightly as she looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore, who had been trying to make herself invisible near the ballroom's entrance. Because sometimes you reach a point where dignity requires you to show people exactly who they're dealing with. When someone tells you that people like you don't belong in spaces like this, sometimes the best response is to prove that you don't just belong, you excel. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the room understood what had transpired earlier. How Maya had been treated, how assumptions had been made based on her position and appearance. Richard stepped forward, his face flushed with shame and determination. "Maya, I need to apologize to you publicly in front of all these witnesses. What happened earlier was inexcusable. I allowed prejudice to cloud my judgment, and I'm deeply sorry." "We all did," added Mr. Harrison, the museum director. "We saw a uniform instead of a person. We made assumptions instead of asking questions." Dr. Chen pulled up another article on her phone. "Look at this," she said, showing the screen to nearby guests. "Her performance tonight was even better than I remembered. Listen to what the Boston Globe wrote after her Symphony Hall performance. Ms. Johnson possesses that rarest of qualities in a classical musician, the ability to make familiar music sound newly discovered. Her Rachmaninoff was breathtaking, not just for its technical perfection, but for its emotional authenticity." "That's exactly what we just experienced," breathed a guest who had been skeptical at the beginning of the evening. Maya looked around the ballroom, taking in the faces of people who had transformed from judges to admirers in the span of an hour. "The irony," she said, "is that I never stopped being a musician. I've been playing piano every day for the past 3 years in hospitals and nursing homes for children with special needs. Music doesn't require an audience of donors in evening wear to be meaningful." The words carried a gentle rebuke that landed with perfect accuracy. Dr. Chen stepped closer to Maya, her voice filled with professional excitement. "The classical music world needs to know you're back. There are opportunities, contracts, performances." Maya held up a hand gently. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate that, but I'm not the same person who left 3 years ago. I'm not sure I want the same things I wanted then." "But your talent?" someone protested. "My talent will always be there," Maya replied. "The question is how I choose to share it. Tonight felt right because it was honest, because it was about more than just music, it was about truth." She looked directly at Richard Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, you offered me a choice earlier, reveal who I am, in exchange for saving your evening. I think I've held up my end of the bargain." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "More than held up your end. You've given us all something we'll never forget." Maya's smile was radiant. "Then perhaps we can discuss what happens next." The ballroom buzzed with excitement as guests realized they weren't just witnessing the end of an extraordinary performance, they were watching the beginning of what promised to be an equally extraordinary transformation. The transformation in the ballroom was now complete and irreversible. Maya Johnson stood at the piano like a queen reclaiming her throne, no longer the invisible waitress, but a revealed artist whose reputation was spreading through the room with each whispered phone call and hurried text message. Mrs. Whitmore had been edging toward the exit for the past 10 minutes, but her retreat was noticed. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the animated conversations with surgical precision. "Mrs. Whitmore, surely you're not leaving. After all, you were so concerned about maintaining standards earlier this evening." Every head turned toward the mayor's wife, who froze like a deer in headlights. Her face had gone from pale to a sickly gray as the social implications of her behavior became crystal clear. In their rarefied social circle, publicly humiliating a celebrated artist was more than embarrassing. It was career-ending. I think there may have been some misunderstanding earlier," Mrs. Whitmore stammered, attempting damage control that was far too late. Maya stepped forward with the same quiet authority she had displayed at the piano. "No misunderstanding, Mrs. Whitmore. You said people like me don't belong in spaces like this. You tried to have me removed from service. You suggested I didn't have the breeding for this environment." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Several guests pulled out their phones, not to text, but to discreetly record what promised to be a moment of social reckoning. Those comments were taken out of context. Mrs. Whitmore began desperately. Context. Maya's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. The context was a charity gala for music education, where you tried to silence someone whose music education began in public schools, whose talent was nurtured by teachers who believed every child deserves access to beauty, regardless of their background. Mr. Harrison, the museum director, stepped forward. Catherine, I think you owe Ms. Johnson an apology. A real one. But Mrs. Whitmore's social survival instincts had kicked in. Rather than face the humiliation of a public apology, she chose flight. I have another engagement, she muttered, practically fleeing toward the exit. Catherine, called out Mrs. Pemberton, but it was too late. The mayor's wife had chosen to compound her humiliation by refusing to acknowledge her wrongs. The room buzzed with shocked murmurs. In their social circle, such behavior was unthinkable. Mrs. Whitmore had just committed social suicide in front of 300 witnesses. Well, Dr. Chen said dryly, I suppose we know who doesn't have the breeding for this environment. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, relieving some of the tension. Richard Sterling stepped forward, seizing the moment to begin his own redemption. Maya, I want to offer you something more substantial than an apology. I want to make this right. Maya tilted her head, curious. I'm listening. First, I want to offer you the position of cultural director for the Sterling Hotel Group. Not just this property, but all of them. You would oversee our music programs, curate our entertainment, ensure that every Sterling hotel becomes a venue where art and excellence are celebrated. The murmur of approval from the crowd was immediate. This wasn't just a job offer, it was an acknowledgement of Maya's stature and expertise. The salary would be commensurate with your qualifications and experience, Richard continued, and you would have complete creative control over programming. Maya considered this for a moment. What would you expect in return? Your expertise, your vision, and perhaps forgiveness for my failure to see who you really were. There's more, Dr. Chen interjected excitedly. Maya, the Steinway Society has been looking for an artist in residence for their educational outreach program. After tonight's performance, I guarantee they'd want to discuss it with you. Other opportunities began flowing immediately. A representative from the symphony orchestra approached with talk of guest performances. Someone from the university mentioned artist residencies. The recording industry executive who had been filming Maya's performance discreetly suggested lunch meetings. Maya held up her hands, overwhelmed but smiling. These are all wonderful offers, and I'm grateful for them, but I need to be clear about my terms. The room quieted, everyone eager to hear what the evening's revealed star would demand. I don't want to go back to the career I had before, Maya said firmly. That career was about proving I belonged in your world. But tonight has taught me something important. I don't need to belong in your world. You need artists like me in yours. The distinction was subtle but profound, and the sophisticated audience understood it immediately. So if I take any of these opportunities, Maya continued, it will be on my terms. I won't perform just for wealthy patrons. I won't change my interpretive style to fit conservative expectations. And I will never, ever apologize for bringing my full self, my background, my experience, my perspective to my art. The silence that followed was respectful, impressed. Are those terms acceptable, Mr. Sterling? Richard smiled, and for the first time all evening it reached his eyes. Ms. Johnson, I wouldn't have it any other way. The applause that followed was different from before. Not just appreciation for her musical talent, but recognition of a woman who had transformed humiliation into empowerment, who had turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for education. Maya Johnson had not just reclaimed her musical voice, she had rewritten the rules of engagement entirely. The gala had officially ended, but no one seemed eager to leave. Clusters of guests surrounded Maya, like planets orbiting a newly discovered star, each group hoping for a private moment with the evening's revelation. Business cards appeared from jacket pockets and evening purses as music industry professionals, cultural patrons, and media representatives positioned themselves for future conversations. Maya handled the attention with grace born of experience, but Richard could see the exhaustion beginning to show around her eyes. The emotional toll of her performance, combined with the intensity of revealing her identity to a room full of strangers, was taking its effect. "Perhaps we could give Ms. Johnson some space," Richard suggested, gently but firmly dispersing the crowds. "I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities to speak with her in the coming days." As the ballroom gradually emptied, only a small group remained. Maya, Richard, Dr. Chen, and a handful of staff members who had witnessed the evening's transformation. Carmen approached Maya with tears of pride in her eyes. "Baby girl, I knew there was something special about you, but this—" Carmen shook her head in amazement. "You just changed everything. Not just tonight, but everything." Maya embraced the older woman warmly. "Carmen, you gave me the courage to step forward. You reminded me that I had power when I felt powerless." "What happens now?" Dr. Chen asked, settling into one of the ballroom's elegant chairs. "I mean, practically speaking, the classical music world is going to be buzzing about this by tomorrow morning." Richard loosened his tie, the formal evening having given way to something more intimate and honest. "First, we need to address the immediate situation. Maya, you're obviously not returning to waitress duties. Even if you declined my offer, I couldn't ask you to go back to that after what happened tonight." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate that, and I want you to know that your offer is generous, more than generous. But I need time to think about what I really want." "Of course, take all the time you need." James, the assistant manager, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, there's going to be fallout from tonight. Mrs. Whitmore's husband is the mayor. The hotel's relationship with the city will be just fine," Richard cut him off firmly. "Mrs. Whitmore behaved disgracefully tonight, and everyone saw it. If the mayor has a problem with his wife being held accountable for her actions, that's his issue to resolve." Dr. Chen pulled out her phone, scrolling through the messages and notifications that had been accumulating. "Maya, you need to see this. The video of your performance is already circulating. Someone posted it to social media, and it's being shared rapidly." Maya's expression grew concerned. "What kind of video?" "Nothing invasive," Dr. Chen assured her quickly. "Just your performance of the final movement. But listen to some of these comments. Who is this woman? This is the most beautiful piano playing I've ever heard. Why isn't she famous? There are already thousands of shares." Richard ran a hand through his hair. "Maya, I'm afraid your privacy might be compromised whether you want it or not. This kind of viral moment, it tends to take on a life of its own." "Let me see," Maya said, taking Dr. Chen's phone. She watched a portion of the video, seeing herself from the audience's perspective for the first time. The woman on the screen looked confident, radiant, completely in command of both the music and the moment. It was almost hard to believe it was her. "The comments are incredible," Dr. Chen said. "People are calling it one of the most moving performances they've ever witnessed. And these aren't just casual viewers. I see comments from musicians, critics, industry professionals." Carmen laughed. "Honey, you broke the internet with a piano. That's got to be some kind of record." Maya handed the phone back, her expression thoughtful. 3 years ago, this kind of attention would have terrified me. The pressure, the expectations, the way everything gets analyzed and picked apart. But now, Richard prompted gently. "Now I think I'm old enough and wise enough to handle it on my own terms." She looked directly at him. "That cultural director position, would it allow me to create educational programs, outreach to underserved communities?" "Absolutely. Whatever vision you have, we can make it happen." "What about performance opportunities that don't require me to compromise my artistic integrity?" Dr. Chen leaned forward eagerly. "Maya, after tonight you can write your own ticket. Organizations will line up to work with you exactly as you are." Maya was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of how her life had changed in the span of a few hours. "You know what the strangest part is? I thought I was saving your evening, Richard, but I think I was actually saving myself." Richard's smile was warm and genuine. "Maybe we saved each other." The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Carmen noticed the exchange and smiled knowingly. "Well," Dr. Chen said, standing and gathering her things, "I should let you all get some rest. Maya, I'll be in touch about the Steinway Society opportunity, and probably a dozen other opportunities by tomorrow morning." As Dr. Chen left, the ballroom felt suddenly intimate. The massive space that had hosted 300 guests now contained just Maya, Richard, Carmen, and James. The grand piano sat silent, but somehow still resonant with the echoes of the evening's performance. "Carmen, James, why don't you head home?" Richard suggested. "It's been a long night for everyone." Carmen squeezed Maya's hand one more time. "I'm proud of you, baby girl. Your mama would be proud too." After they left, Maya and Richard stood alone in the ballroom, the silence both comfortable and electric. "So," Richard said quietly, "what really happens next?" Maya looked at the piano, then back at him. "I think that depends on whether you really meant what you said about wanting to make things right." "I did. I do." "Then maybe we start over, from the beginning, as equals this time." Richard extended his hand formally. "Richard Sterling, pleased to meet you, Ms. Johnson." Maya shook it, smiling. "Maya Johnson, and the pleasure is entirely mutual." 2 days later, the Sterling Grand Hotel buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with its usual luxury operations. Word of Maya's performance had spread far beyond the walls of the ballroom, and the hotel found itself at the center of a cultural conversation that was both inspiring and uncomfortable. Richard sat in his office, reviewing the morning's developments. His assistant had fielded over 50 media requests since Monday morning. The hotel's social media followers had tripled overnight. Most significantly, he'd received calls from 3 different civil rights organizations wanting to discuss the evening's events and their implications for service industry treatment of employees. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in?" Maya entered no longer in a service uniform, but dressed in an elegant navy blazer and slacks that spoke of professional authority. She carried herself differently now, not just the physical transformation, but an energy that commanded attention without demanding it. "Good morning," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I've been thinking about your offer, and I want to accept, but with modifications." Maya placed a folder on his desk. "I've spent the last 2 days researching your entire hotel chain, your staff demographics, your community engagement programs, or rather your lack of community engagement programs." Richard opened the folder to find a comprehensive analysis that would have impressed his most experienced business consultants. "You have 12 properties across 4 states, Maya continued. "Your staff is 68% people of color, but your management is 85% white. Your marketing materials feature diverse models, but your actual programming serves almost exclusively wealthy, predominantly white clienteles." The statistics hit like physical blows. Richard had never examined his company through this lens, despite priding himself on being progressive. "I want to change that," Maya said firmly. "If I'm going to be your cultural director, I want carte blanche to implement real diversity initiatives. Not performative gestures, but substantive changes, such as staff education programs that go beyond basic sensitivity training, community partnerships with local schools and arts organizations, scholarship programs for young musicians from underserved communities, and most importantly, a complete review of hiring and promotion practices." Richard studied the proposal, recognizing both its ambition and its necessity. "This is going to be expensive. Less expensive than the lawsuit you're probably going to face if you don't address these issues proactively." "Lawsuit." Maya's expression was serious. "Richard, what happened to me Saturday night wasn't an isolated incident. I've spent 2 days talking to your staff. Carmen told me about the servers who've been passed over for promotion because guests complained about their accents. James mentioned the housekeeper who was transferred to night shift because a guest said she made them uncomfortable. This is a pattern, not an anomaly." The words settled heavily between them. Richard realized that Saturday night hadn't just revealed Maya's hidden talent, it had exposed his company's hidden problems. "There's more," Maya continued. "Mrs. Whitmore's behavior is already having consequences. 3 different guests from Saturday night have called to express their disgust with how I was treated. The mayor's office received enough complaints that they issued a statement distancing themselves from her comments." Richard's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it and grimaced. "Speaking of consequences, Mrs. Whitmore just resigned from the Arts Council board. Apparently, the other board members asked for her resignation after Saturday night's incident became public knowledge." Good, Maya said without hesitation. Actions should have consequences. She's also been disinvited from the governor's arts gala next month. The organizers said they couldn't risk having someone with her documented prejudices representing their event. Maya nodded approvingly. The classical music community is small and interconnected. Word travels fast and reputation matters. She's going to find herself persona non grata at cultural events for quite some time. Richard closed the folder and looked directly at Maya. You know, when I offered you this position, I was thinking about damage control, making amends for my own mistakes. But reading this proposal, I realize you're offering me something much more valuable, which is a chance to actually be the company I always claimed we were. Maya smiled. That's exactly what I'm offering. The question is whether you're ready for the hard work it's going to require. What kind of hard work? Honest conversations with staff about their experiences, uncomfortable admissions about past failures, real financial commitment to change, not just cosmetic improvements. And probably most challenging for someone in your position, giving up some control to let communities tell you what they actually need instead of what you think they need. Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Maya was proposing. It wasn't just a job offer anymore. It was a complete transformation of his business philosophy. If we do this, he said finally, I want you to know that you'll have my full support, financial, administrative, whatever you need. Even when the changes make you uncomfortable, especially then. Maya extended her hand across the desk. Then you have yourself a cultural director, Mr. Sterling. As they shook hands, Richard felt the weight of commitment settling over him. Saturday night had been about Maya reclaiming her identity. Today was about him choosing to become the leader he should have been all along. When do we start? He asked. Maya's smile was brilliant. We already have. 3 weeks later. The Sterling Grand's ballroom had been transformed into something unprecedented in its gilded history. 25 children from the city's public schools sat at borrowed keyboards, their faces bright with concentration as Maya demonstrated proper finger positioning at the grand piano. The contrast was striking. These kids in their everyday clothes, creating music in a space usually reserved for black tie galas. Remember, Maya called out, her voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect room. The piano doesn't care what neighborhood you're from or what your parents do for work. It only cares whether you're willing to listen and learn. 8-year-old Marcus, whose single mother cleaned offices at night to make ends meet, tentatively played the simple melody Maya had taught them. When he hit the right sequence of notes, his grin was radiant. Ms. Maya, called out Sophia, a 12-year-old, whose family had immigrated from Guatemala the previous year. Can you play that Russian song again, the one that sounds like a storm? Maya smiled, settling at the piano. Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2, the one that changed my life 3 weeks ago. As she played the opening measures, the children fell silent, transported by the music. But Maya noticed something else. Richard standing in the ballroom's entrance, watching with an expression she'd never seen before. Not the calculating businessman or the polished host, but someone genuinely moved by what he was witnessing. After the lesson ended and the children were loaded onto their school bus, Richard approached Maya at the piano. That was incredible, he said quietly. I've been watching from the back for the last few minutes. These kids, they're completely captivated. Maya closed the piano lid gently. Music has that power. It doesn't matter if you're 8 years old in hand-me-down clothes or 80 years old in designer gowns. Beauty is beauty. Is this what you meant about community engagement that actually serves communities? Partly. But watch what happens next week when these kids go home and tell their families about playing piano at the Sterling Grand. Watch what happens when their parents realize that spaces like this aren't just for other people's children. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd watched Maya implement changes with a combination of strategic brilliance and genuine compassion that consistently amazed him. The diversity training sessions she'd designed were unlike anything he'd experienced, not corporate sensitivity modules, but honest conversations about how assumptions affected real people's lives. How are the staff responding to the new initiatives? He asked. Maya's expression was cautiously optimistic. Better than I expected. Carmen has been helping me identify employees who've been overlooked for advancement opportunities. We've already promoted 3 servers to management training positions, and 2 housekeepers have enrolled in the hospitality management program we partnered with the community college to create. And the guest response? Mixed as expected. We've lost a few clients who are uncomfortable with our new direction, but we've gained more than we've lost. Turns out there are plenty of people who want to support businesses that actually live their values. Richard moved closer to the piano, running his fingers along its polished surface. Maya, can I ask you something personal? She looked up curious. That night 3 weeks ago, when you chose to play instead of staying hidden, what finally pushed you to do it? Maya was quiet for a moment, considering. Honestly, it was realizing that my mother didn't sacrifice her dreams so that I could hide mine. She worked 3 jobs and went without things she needed so that I could have piano lessons. She sat through chemotherapy, listening to classical music because it reminded her that beauty still existed in the world. Her voice grew stronger. When Mrs. Whitmore tried to make me feel ashamed of who I am, I realized that staying silent would be betraying everything my mother taught me about dignity and worth. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was. She would have loved seeing those children today. She always said that music was meant to be shared, not hoarded. Richard found himself studying Maya's profile as she spoke about her mother. Over the past weeks, he'd watched her transform his business practices, challenge his assumptions, and create opportunities where none had existed before. But more than that, he'd found himself genuinely eager for their daily meetings, looking forward to her insights and perspectives in ways that had nothing to do with business. Maya, he said carefully, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I'd like to ask you to dinner. Not as your employer, but as someone who would very much like to know you better outside of our professional relationship. Maya turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. Richard, 3 weeks ago, you dismissed me as incompetent help. Now you're asking me on a date. Don't you think that's a rather dramatic shift? He felt heat rise in his cheeks. When you put it like that, it sounds terrible. It does, doesn't it? But there was amusement in her voice, not anger. However, I've also watched you completely reorganize your business practices, challenge your own staff about their biases, and genuinely commit to changes that are costing you money and comfort. That's not the same man who made assumptions about me based on my uniform. So is that a yes? Maya's smile was soft but teasing. Maybe we start with coffee and see if the man asking me out is the Richard Sterling who's been working to earn my respect, or the one who still sees me as the waitress who got above herself. Richard laughed, the sound genuine and warm. Coffee sounds perfect. When? Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. There's a place called Mama's Kitchen, about 3 blocks from here. They serve the best coffee in the city, and they don't care if you show up in a tuxedo or work clothes. I'll be there. As Maya gathered her things to leave, Richard found himself watching her with something that felt like wonder. 3 weeks ago, she had saved his evening. Now he was beginning to suspect she might be saving much more than that. The next morning, Mama's Kitchen. Richard arrived at Mama's Kitchen 15 minutes early, nervous in a way he hadn't felt since high school. The small cafe was nothing like the polished restaurants he usually frequented. Mismatched chairs, handwritten menu boards, and the comfortable chaos of a neighborhood gathering place. He ordered coffee and claimed a table near the window, watching the morning foot traffic of people heading to work. Maya arrived precisely at 7, wearing jeans and a simple sweater that somehow made her look more elegant than the designer gowns he'd seen at charity galas. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, Richard Sterling hotel magnate, sitting in a working-class cafe, looking completely out of place, but genuinely trying to belong. You came, she said, sliding into the chair across from him. Did you think I wouldn't? I thought there was a 50-50 chance you'd send your assistant with an excuse about an urgent business matter. Richard winced. Is that really what you think of me? Maya signaled the waitress for coffee before answering. Richard, 3 weeks ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Today I'm here to find out. They ordered Richard following Maya's recommendation for the breakfast special and settled into conversation that started cautiously but gradually grew more comfortable. Tell me about your vision for the next year, Maya said, stirring cream into her coffee. Not the business plans or profit projections. What do you actually want to accomplish? Richard considered the question seriously. I want to prove that a luxury business can be successful without compromising its values or exploiting its workers. I want other hotel chains to look at what we're doing and realize they've been operating from a false choice between profitability and ethics. That's a good answer, very politically correct. But Maya's smile was gentle but challenging. But I asked what you want to accomplish, not what you want to prove to other people. The distinction hit him like a revelation. I want to stop being ashamed of who I was 3 weeks ago. I want to become someone worthy of the respect you've shown me, despite having every reason not to. Better answer. And you? What's your vision? Maya gazed out the window at the morning rush of people, construction workers, office employees, parents walking children to school. I want to create a model for how cultural institutions can actually serve their communities instead of just existing alongside them. I want kids like Marcus and Sophia to grow up knowing that spaces like the Sterling Grand aren't foreign territory. They're part of their city, their heritage. And personally, I want to make peace with my mother's death by living the life she would have wanted me to live. Not the life I thought I was supposed to want, but the one that honors her sacrifices and my gifts. Richard reached across the table, covering her hand with his. For what it's worth, I think she would be incredibly proud of who you've become. Maya didn't pull her hand away. You know what the strangest part of the last 3 weeks has been? What? Realizing that I don't need anyone's approval anymore. Not the classical music establishments, not the hotel guests, not even yours. That's incredibly liberating. Then why are you here with me? Maya's smile was radiant. Because you've earned the right to be considered. Not because of your position or your money, but because you've shown me that you're capable of growth. That's attractive in a way that power and wealth never could be. The conversation continued over breakfast, ranging from business philosophy to childhood memories to dreams for the future. Richard found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about the pressure of inheriting his father's business, about the loneliness of always being seen as a resource rather than a person, about his fear that success had made him smaller rather than larger. Maya listened with the same attentiveness she brought to music, hearing not just the words, but the emotions beneath them. Can I ask you something? Richard said as they prepared to leave. Of course. That night you played, you said the best revenge is excellence. Do you still see this as revenge? Maya considered the question carefully. No. Revenge implies that I'm still defined by what was done to me. What I'm doing now, the programs, the changes, even this conversation, this is about creation, not destruction. This is about building something better. As they walked back toward the hotel, Richard felt something shift between them. The careful professional boundaries were still there, but underneath was something warmer, more personal. Maya, he said as they reached the Sterling Grand's entrance. I'd like to take you to dinner, somewhere nicer than Mama's kitchen, but somewhere that would meet with your approval. I know just the place, Maya replied. There's a little Ethiopian restaurant in my neighborhood. The owner's daughter is one of my piano students. They make incredible food, and the music, traditional Ethiopian jazz fusion, is extraordinary. It sounds perfect. Saturday night, 7:30. I'll be there. As Maya headed toward the elevator to her new office, Richard realized that for the first time in years, he was genuinely excited about the future. Not just professionally, but personally. Maya Johnson had indeed saved his evening 3 weeks ago. But she might just save much more than that. The Sterling Grand's ballroom sparkled with familiar elegance, but the energy was completely different from that night in February. Tonight's gala, music for all celebrating cultural excellence and community partnership, drew a crowd that reflected the city's true diversity. Corporate executives sat beside public school teachers, symphony patrons, chatted with community activists, and young music students from Maya's programs performed alongside established artists. Maya stood at the same grand piano where her life had changed, but this time she wore a stunning burgundy gown and the quiet confidence of someone who had fully reclaimed her place in the world. The program in her hands listed her as both performer and honoree, the Steinway Society's Artist of the Year, for her community outreach work. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard's voice carried through the ballroom as he took the microphone. 6 months ago, this room witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a musical performance, but a lesson in the power of assumptions, the importance of dignity, and the transformative nature of truth. In the audience, Dr. Chen beamed with pride. Carmen, now promoted to hospitality manager, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even the mayor was there, having publicly distanced himself from his ex-wife's behavior and endorsed the hotel's new community initiatives. Tonight, we celebrate not just Maya Johnson's artistry, but the programs she's created that have touched over 300 young musicians in our city. We celebrate the partnerships that have made the Sterling Grand not just a luxury destination, but a cultural bridge. Richard's eyes found Maya's across the room. Most importantly, we celebrate the idea that excellence comes in many forms, often wearing unexpected uniforms, and that the most extraordinary people are sometimes hidden in plain sight. The applause was warm and genuine. Maya approached the microphone, her presence commanding the room with natural authority. 6 months ago, I played this piano to prove a point, she said, her voice clear and strong. Tonight I play it to honor a promise, the promise my mother made when she sacrificed so that I could have music lessons, and the promise I made to her that I would never let anyone make me smaller than I am. She took her place at the piano bench, her hands finding the keys like coming home. This is for everyone who's ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they don't belong. This is for the servers and the housekeepers, the students and the dreamers. This is for my mother, who taught me that dignity isn't something you're given, it's something you claim. Maya began to play not Rachmaninoff this time, but an original composition she had written called Rising. The melody started gentle, almost hesitant, then built with increasing power and complexity until it filled the ballroom with pure joy. In the audience, Richard Sterling listened with wonder, knowing he was witnessing not just a performance, but a declaration. Maya Johnson had risen, and she was taking her community with her. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are indeed hidden in plain sight until they decide it's time to shine.